And what we're trying to do today is just talk about kind of how this world works in a way that is helpful for you. And we've broken it down into kind of three, rules. 5 rules, if you like. We're not going to talk about how to write an application, right? There's a lot of advice that you can get on that. So if you came to learn how to write your application itself, we won't cover that. What we're going to talk about is the world that sits around the application. So how to learn to ask for funding. Where do you go for it? Who are you talking to? How does this process work? Try and demystify that a bit. Be the funding body. Get into their heads, understand what they're looking for, understand how they work so that you can give them what they want, right? No problem, Sue. We'll see you if you can get back. Get the team right. Right, so it's no good having everyone the same. There's got to be diversity. There's got to be different skills, and how to present yourself as a team. Now, it might be a team of 1 if you're applying for a fellowship, right? But it's still about, well, who's on the team and how you're going to present them. Get the project right. This is a project in these terms is defined by this amount of time and this amount of money, right? So what are you going to present? And what can you do in that amount of time with that amount of money? And how can that be interesting? Who's that interesting to? How's that going to work, right? And working with partners as well. And then have time on your side. For whoever said it all seemed very rushed, absolutely, we're going to talk about how do you actually plan this out so that it becomes something that is part of your job, part of your work, because as academics, it is part of your work. Whether we believe that's a good thing or not is a different question. But the reality is it is part of your work. And so we'll see how you can put that into your role and make it so that it's not rushed, so that you're giving it the time that it needs. Next slide, please, Colleen. Okay. Yep, keep going. We're not gonna focus on an application itself. All right, so what's it like out there? Colleen, there's just 4 points here, and we'll bring them up one at a time. So expected to do more with less. Absolutely. There are less people in your faculty than there were at the start of the pandemic, I'm willing to bet, right? And the expectations from the university just keep getting bigger and bigger. And that's partly because the expectations from the government just keep getting bigger and bigger. Now, and also, because there are more problems out there to solve, right? They're not going away anytime soon. They're just getting harder. Now, we can go, well, that's wrong, and it shouldn't be that way, but that's not helpful in accepting the realities of the situation and just getting on and doing the job. They're two separate discussions. I don't mind having that discussion, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is how do we cope with that? Carly? Next. She's gone. Who cares if you get a grant? Okay, very briefly, you care, right? Getting funded is one of the ways to get a permanent job or to get promoted, right? And also, these are transferable skills. So even if you move out of academia, everyone loves someone who says, oh, yes, I planned a project, I got that project funded, we did that project, right? They are skills that every employer loves. Your university really cares about this. There's $2 billion riding on you getting grants. So, no pressure. $2 billion is what the Australian government distributes to all universities across Australia in terms of the funds for PhD students, so PhD stipends, and the research block grant, which is infrastructure funding to run the research at the university. And one of the measures they use is the amount of funding that the university brings in. So that concentrates the mind of the university, and that's where some of that pressure will come from. And also your discipline. You are creating new knowledge. You are furthering the boundaries of what we understand about the world. And that's really important. We need that. And your discipline needs that. So you are pushing things forward, and that's important. And also your collaborators, right? You will, not everyone, but a lot of people will be working with outside groups, and they need your help. They don't have that knowledge themselves, so it's really important that you can help them. Next point. Yeah, okay. So the government is putting more pressure on the universities, and that is often coming through in terms of, I don't think it's going to change with the new government. In fact, they've indicated that they will be going ahead with some of this. In terms of being able to show value for money. And that means being able to show what we did and how that had a positive impact on the world. Now, it doesn't all need to do that. There's still space for theoretical work, but if there's philosophers in the room, that's okay. But the government is saying, well, we want to move it from a concentration on, if you like, pure research to more applied research. For a lot of you, from what you described, that's going to be an advantage. Next, please, Carleen. Yeah, a lot of people just hear ARC, the Australian Research Council. There are two big councils in Australia, three. The Australian Research Council, the National Health and Medical Research Council, which funds health funding, and Australia Council for the Arts, which funds practicing artists, right? If you took all the money that they put together and combined and compared it with all the money from all the other organisations that are out there, there's way more in the other bucket than there is from those three. And yet those three, and in particular the ARC and the NHMRC, are the ones you hear a lot. So we want to talk about other buckets. We want to talk about other possibilities and building to the point where you are competitive to be applying for those big grants from the ARC. But you can go your whole career and get millions of dollars of funding and never apply to the ARC, and that's fine, right? And we should say that we should be very clear about that. Next slide, please. Okay, rule 1, learn how to ask for funding. Do you know what you're asking for, and do you know why? And I'm just going to quickly go through this, and then we're going to do a little exercise. So one of the issues is, and you might have a program of research that you're working on, but that's different from a research project that can be funded, right? So sometimes we see that it's not the, it's that you're not quite describing your research in a way that the funder can understand. But we want to talk about how you get there, right? So what funding are you after? What stage of your research are you at? So for example, you might be at the stage where you need to build collaborations with people. So that means you might be looking for travel funding to go back to Argentina, or to go to the UK to work with those collaborators there, or to go just, to, I don't know, to Wagga Wagga to work with someone there. You might need travel funding just to build the relationships. You might need seed funding. You've got an idea, but you don't have any evidence that that idea will work. So you need a bit of funding to just prove the idea. Get it to the point where you've got some data, some preliminary data, and you can actually say, here's a testable idea, right? Here's something that we can really try on. You might be looking for grant funding. You might say, okay, I'm ready to apply. I'm ready. I know what I'm going to do. I know how long it's going to take. I know how much it's going to cost. We can go from there. And if that's the case, okay, that's project funding that you're looking for. You might be at the end where you're looking for funding to disseminate your research. That might be working with stakeholders to put something into practice, right? Where you've tested something and now you want to actually put it out at scale across schools or across communities. Or it might be you just need some funding to get a publication out, and particularly a publication that's not your standard kind of publication where it might be, putting it out as a comic, for example, or some other way, making a small documentary, some other way of getting it out there. And so there's lots of different ways you can be funded, but you need to think about where you're at in terms of your research and what you need to do. And you may have several strings to your bow. So you might be thinking, I've got a very early stage project that I need to do some, I need to do some care with. It's just a little egg in a nest. And I've got a late stage project where I really need to now connect with the partners and work with the partners. And they will need different levels of funding, right? Until your project is ready, you're not grant ready. So the problem we see a lot is people putting things in too early, where it's like, actually, this needs a bit more work. And the way you see this is, step one, do a literature review. The problem is most research agencies expect that you will know your field, so they won't be interested in funding that. And I understand that there's a catch-22 there, but that's the reality of the situation. You need to build momentum, maybe through conference papers, maybe through a bit of collaboration with people, maybe through working to get some data. An important thing here, the thing to understand is that means that the start of your project actually happens well before the start of your funded project, right? You've done a whole bunch of work where you've built collaborations with partners, you've maybe got some preliminary data, you've fleshed out the idea, you understand, where it's based, what it's come from intellectually, and then you're going to a funder and saying, all right, I'm ready for some project funding. And they're going to say, well, what's your timeline? And you're not talking about the stuff you've already done. You're talking about what you're going to do in the future. One of the lovely things about grant applications is it's one of the few times where we get to think about the future. Most of the time we're either doing stuff, so we're located in the present, or we're writing it up, which means we're writing about the past for publication. This allows you to imagine a better future. The reason I talk about this so much is because half-baked applications are really dangerous. They affect your credibility, and they don't help anyone in any particular time, in any particular way. You've got to be ready. You've got to be. It's kind of like going to the gym, building up your strength, building up your core muscles, going to Pilates. Okay, next slide. Okay, where are you asking this funding? People mentioned almost all of these. In fact, everyone except the last one. So internal funding. Internal funding is really useful, but don't get addicted to it, right? Most internal funding is given to you on the idea that you will then use that as a springboard for external funding, right? That's kind of the deal. And absolutely, I've seen very cashed up faculties who get trapped in all of their academics are getting internal funding. They don't need external funding. That's more in the business school, accounting, for example. Philanthropic funding, they want to make the world a better place, right? So they are giving you money for, in old terms, would be called civics, for trying to solve social problems, trying to help. Government, there's a whole range of government funding out there. Every bit of the government has problems it's trying to solve, and therefore may be willing to fund research to solve those problems. Now, one of the government areas that got brought up was the state and federal departments of education. Absolutely, they're core funders for your faculty. But every other government agency has problems that you might be interested in. Because the nice thing about a faculty of education is you cover everything, right? You do all the things. And so you can look to all different spaces. Industry, your industry, they might be private schools, they might be public schools, they might be other parts of, and industry here is industry broadly understood. So anything that's not academia, not government. Things that sit on the boundary might be Melbourne Museum, the Zoo, National Gallery of Victoria. Are they government? Are they industry? For these purposes, they're kind of an industry partner, right, where you're working with them, and they will fund a bit of it, but they're looking for other money as well. International, people talked about Argentina and somewhere else in Southeast Asia. It slips my mind. So absolutely, there's a world of international funding out there. You need almost, in the UK, someone was connected to a project in the UK. You almost always need to be connected to someone in that country to effectively access that funds. Yes, the rules say anyone in the world can apply sometimes, but the realities of the situation are you absolutely want to do that with someone in that country. And finally, very briefly, self-funding. We don't talk about this much at all, but if for example, you say, oh, I really want to go to that conference, and yeah, I could apply to the university for a bit of funding to go there, but it's just too hard. I will just fund it myself and claim it back on my tax, right? There's a lot of little bits of funding that happen that way, and we don't really talk about it enough. It's not really a topic I'm going to explore more, but I just put it on the list for completeness because it gets left off. Okay, that's a whirlwind tour of where you can think about for funding. We will talk about that more as we go through. There's a reluctance to ask for funding. Like I said, my PhD is about crowdfunding, and that's absolutely, here's my research topic. By the way, will you give me $50 for that, right? That's really, really hard. But there's also kind of a reluctance to talk to an industry partner, for example, about how much it might cost. And that's a really useful skill to develop, a useful conversation to have. We need, and then you have grant applications, which are just a lot of hard work, and they're very anonymized, right? You write it, you put it in, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months later, you get a result, right? It's a kind of magic box. You don't know what happens in the box. We will demystify the box a bit today. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to really briefly do this because it comes up a lot, and I really don't think it's helpful. It's the way the university categorizes money, and they categorize money that way because it's the way that the government categorizes money. So in giving out that $2 million, the government needs to rank all the universities, who's going to get the most, who's going to get the least. They use these categories to decide it. So category 1, nationally competitive research funds. There's a kind of list of questions. Is it, advertised nationally? Can any university apply in Australia? Yes, all right, it's category 1, right? There's a whole range of different funds in there. The ones that people talk about most are ARC and NH&MRC, and then they're using category 1 for code for prestigious grants, right? And you want to understand that, and you want to untangle that a bit. Category 2, anything else from the government that's not already categorized as category 1. So local government, there's a lot of money in local governments, state government and Commonwealth government. It can be both competitive and not competitive, right? So you might get a contract with the state government to do some research work. That's absolutely category 2. Category 3 is everything else, which is just bizarre. It's just the catch-all category, right? So National Science Foundation in the US, that Research Council grant from the UK, they both sit in category 3. Right, which is weird, right? Because category 3, it's like, well, it's number 3 on the list. They're really number 1 grants. They're really hard to get. But that's just the way the government does it. All donations and bequests sit in this category. All philanthropic funding sits in this category, can be both contracts and can be grants, right? And then category 4, cooperative research centres, they, for historical reasons, get their own category. They're the category that everyone forgets. All right. That's in the slides and in the notes. I've unpacked that further. If you want to understand what people are talking about when they talk about this mysterious category 1 and category 2, go to the notes afterwards and have a look. Next slide, please. Okay, where do we find these funding bodies? The university subscribes to a database called Research Professional. You all have access to it. They have very good help on how to make it work. And I'm sure that there's someone in the university, either the research office at the faculty level or at the university level, or maybe even the library, can help you understand how to build. It's like a publication database. You can do a search, you can save that search. If anything new pops up, the system will send you an email to say, hey, you're looking for funding about sports education. Here's something new that we've added to the database. It's a worldwide database. So if you're, can apply here and apply in Argentina, you can list those things and in your search to make sure you get information from both countries. It's really handy. There's a couple of points here. Carleen, can you just bring them up? You can bring them up all at once. So your university research, back one. Thank you. Your university research office, they can help, and the faculty research office, often have a library of successful applications, which is written, back one. Sorry, thank you. Often have a library of successful applications that can be really helpful, but also they see all the applications going through. So you might have a conversation with Carleen or with her colleagues in the research office, and they say, oh, yes, we've seen that other people that are doing similar things have applied for blah. So that can also be helpful. Academic societies and associations are really helpful because they take all of the different grants that their members apply for and they list them. And they list them in a way that is pertinent to your discipline. So that's really handy. And that can be in two ways, right? So it might be academic society for education researchers, that's helpful. Or it might be, if you're maths education, it might be maths researchers society, right? And they're going, okay, well, here's all the stuff for maths. So that's also helpful. And finally, colleagues and our academic heroes. So the way this works is, and what I would encourage you to do is just next time you're talking to someone about what they're doing for their research, when they say, oh, I'm off to Oslo to go to a conference, who the hell funded you for that, right? Where did you get that funding? We don't ask that question enough. And that can lead to really useful conversations in this space. We want to normalize that discussion of funding because that's where you find out. The same conversation can happen in a different way where you go, I'm really looking for funding for blah, and you're talking to a mentor or you're talking to someone who's a bit more experienced, and they can be helpful for making suggestions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll talk about this more in the Rule 5, but there's a whole bunch of people. It's not just as simple as you write the application, you submit the application. And this is really important to understand. There's a whole bunch of people who can help you, but you need to give them the time that they need to be able to do that. So, your peers can give you feedback, and they give you really good feedback about, is this an exciting idea, right? Is it ready? Your research office can give you a whole bunch of feedback on how to present that idea well, because they've seen a lot of applications, a lot of successful applications. Research leaders often need to see it because they're signing off on your time. They might need to approve it. They might need to say, yes, we approve you doing this. Here's a signature on the dotted line. Or it might be that someone in the grants office is looking at your budget and saying, yes, we approve that you have correctly costed this budget. You've included overheads where you can, you've included salary on costs, all the things that you need to include. And now I'll get someone senior to sign off on it. And absolutely the university will want to sign off on it because the university will make a contract with the funder. It's not you making a contract. The money doesn't come into your personal bank account. It comes into the university. So the university will want to sign off on it in most cases, right? And then it's how do you write this application so it sounds so it sounds sensible, so it sounds useful. And really what you're talking about there is it's just, you want to be, it's a different genre. That's all I want to say here. It's different to writing a grant to writing a journal article, right? You're writing for the future rather than writing for the past. You're writing much more in active tense rather than in passive tense. And you're really trying to get it as clear and as simple as possible. Often you're asking like your partner, your mum, a friend to read it to just see whether they can understand it, so that you're not stuck in an academic world. Because even if an academic's reading it, they've got a tiny amount of time to read it. So you want to get across your ideas as quickly as possible. And absolutely, that last point is important. You live or die by your summary. So almost all applications ask for a little summary of what your project is. And we are going to do an exercise to get you to think about how your summary would work. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to take 10 minutes. And what we're going to do is there are some rules here. You're going to write a project title, and you're going to write a 2-line summary. You're going to only use 2 sentences. So your project title can no longer than 20 words, right? In fact, almost all of them will be shorter than that. And your summary has to say just 2 things. What is your project? So what are you trying to do? And what is the benefit? Why should someone care about this project? And you might put them in the other order. Here's the problem. Here's what I'm going to do. Or here's what I'm going to do. Here's what the benefit will be. I don't care what order they come in. No jargon, no acronyms, absolutely plain language. And what I'll do is I will give you 5 minutes to do that now. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms. There's going to be 2 people in each room. And you are going to just, read your summaries to one another. And the learning is around, well, how did their summary sound? What did I learn from how they did that? Okay, so are there any questions? I've been rushing through this. There's a lot. Rule 1 covered a lot of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to put the timer on, and in 5 minutes, and I'm going to say, let's go into breakout rooms. So you want to have a title for your project, and this is a project that you want to do. You're not making up a fantasy project here. This is something you would like to get funded in the next, say, 12 to 18 months, right? So what's your project title? What's your project? What's the benefit of your project? Let's go.
So before everybody joins in, maybe a small question then.
Sure.
I have the term like a play word in my title, and Bethany had self-determination, which is a kind of an academic position, and it's an important academic term there. Now, when you say how easy it is for anybody to understand, it brings in a kind of an academic expertise, but also it becomes difficult for somebody to understand who is a layperson or who is not from the same area. What would you say about that?
It depends on your audience. Mm-hmm. And something like the ARC, everyone who reads it, except for the minister's advisor, is going to be an academic, right? But almost every other funding agency you go to, that's not going to be the case, right? So the sorts of terms that we use that have a lot of encoding in them are really difficult, because yes, they reduce a concept down to something very, very dense and very short, but that's not helpful for your audience, right? If it's a philanthropic grant, or you're going out to an industry person, or even I've done this exercise, if you'd use that term with someone even in the Faculty of Education that wasn't familiar with your area, that may have presented problems. It certainly would have probably presented problems to someone from the faculty that I work in. I currently work in the Faculty of Science. So a physicist might have had a completely different conception of that. So that's why we emphasize, go down to very common language, because you can always build up, right? But you can't go the other way. If you give someone and you lose them, you'll never get them back. Whereas you can build quite complex ideas with relatively simple language. It's just often we don't do that.
Sure.
Okay, I think we've got everyone back now. So shall we just take a brief break? I'm going to make it 3 minutes where we can stand, and please take the breaks, right? Because otherwise you're going to be sitting for the next 2.5 hours. And I'm certainly going to take the break. So 3 minutes on the clock. We're going to stand up. We're going to walk around. You're going to get a drink if you need to. I'll see you back here at 1:43. So rule 2 is be the funding body. Get inside the mind of the funding body. The basic dynamic here is you want their money. They are legally obliged to give away their money. Well, granting bodies are anyway. So what you're trying to do is get them to give it to you. And it's kind of as simple as that, but there's a load of complexity in there. They want to give away their money to the best projects, but best is defined very, very differently for different organizations, right? And the nice thing about grant funding is most funding agencies try very hard to tell you what they want, right? They give you a set of guidelines that says, in excruciating detail sometimes, here's what we want to fund, right? And here's my novelty t-shirt moment. Read the guidelines, right? This is your main rule to come out of this is you can learn a lot from how they write their guidelines. And it can be very different across different organisations. So I just want to quickly take 2 examples, the Australian Research Council and the one that's just closed now, William Buckland Foundation. And I know I'm going to talk about how that works in a second and the problem that you had. So next slide, please. Okay, so your standard ARC discovery project, 50 to 100 pages, maybe more, right? It generally takes the ARC 9 months to give you an answer, right? They will fund everything except for health funding, right? They will, but what they are trying to fund is the most excellent research, right? They'll fund up to 5 years, and in each year, and most people are normally applying for 3. In theory, you can apply for 1 or 2. Most people don't. You can ask for as low as $30,000 per year, as much as $500,000 per year, right? Most people are well and truly in the middle of that, towards the kind of $250,000 per year mark. William Buckland, by contrast, 7-page expression of interest. I would calculate that of those 7 pages, there's probably about less than 1,000 words, maybe 1,000 words tops, right? They will give you an answer relatively quickly. I've said 3 to 4 months here. It may even be briefer than that. But they're very, very niche, right? They want to use education to lift disadvantaged children and young Victorians and bring them up into the world, reduce their disadvantage. They'll give you up to 4 years of funding, and their minimum is $50,000. The ARC thinks you can get out of bed for $30,000 a year. The William Buckland says, no, it's not worth doing anything for less than $50,000 per year. But the maximum they'll give you is $150,000 per year. So the total grant is much smaller. And William Buckland did a weird thing, right? They came in late in the day, and it wasn't in their general guidelines to say, we only want 1 application from the Faculty of Education. And that's a real problem. The Australian Research Council, by contrast, its guidelines are legislative instruments. They have to go to Treasury to be approved before they come out into the world. So they are going to try really, really hard not to vary those guidelines, right? Whereas William Buckland, they've got a bit more flexibility. They can say, oh, no, look, we don't want to see 6 or 7 applications from you. We just want to see 1 application. But they didn't put it in the guidelines, which created chaos, right? The other thing that they publish is, and in particular, philanthropics, but also industry partners will do this as well. and government agencies will do this, they publish things like who they've funded in the past, right? In their annual report, they give examples of the projects they're really chuffed about, right? And you can see that, right? So you can get a real sense of not just what they've said in their guidelines, but of what is really helpful and what they've funded in the past. And that can be a real indicator. The other rule in terms of be the funding body is think about if they give you a phone number, think about ringing them up and having a conversation with them. Now, don't do this with the ARC, right? The ARC, if you've got a question for the ARC, go to the faculty. The faculty will transfer it to the central research office. The central research office will talk to the ARC and the answer will flow down, right? And that's the way the ARC absolutely wants things to happen. If a funding agency like William Buckland doesn't publish a phone number, then they're saying don't ring us. But if they do publish a phone number, they're saying do ring us. The Australian, I've forgotten the name right now, the Australian Communications Authority, Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, in their guidelines says, if you're going to apply, have a conversation with us first, right? And what they're doing with these conversations is they're trying to eliminate the applications that would never get funded, so saving you time. They're trying to put the best applications in front of their board, so improve the quality of the applications that they see. And they're trying to just demystify the process. So take advantage of that where you can. Next slide, please. I feel like I should be Tinkerbell and ring a little bell for the next slide. Okay. The other thing that funding agencies talk about or publish is their priorities, their strategic goals. They might give them different headings. Often they're called priority areas, and William Buckland had 3, right, for this round. The ARC's priority is excellence, so it just funds the best. But every other funding agency will have quite specific funding guidelines and generally be able to tell you exactly what they want and what they want this round, right? Quite often they will work to produce, here are our priority areas for this round or for the next 3 years or for the next 5 years, right? And if you're not in those priority areas, don't bother applying, but be lateral, right? Think about how you might fit. So the issue that we see is I am really passionate about cucumber education, right? That's my overriding. I just want to educate the world about cucumbers, right? And cucumbers are not listed in the priority area. You know, nutrition might be listed in the priority area, or rural issues might be listed in the priority area. But if you're focused just on, I just want to do cucumbers, you will miss that, right? And often we see the other problem is, well, I'm just interested in educating the world about the wonderful world of cucumbers. And so I'll put this into this education funding agency about cucumbers. But their priority areas are nothing to do with that. They're nothing to do with farming. They're nothing to do with nutrition. I just seized on the word education. And if I don't fit, if I can't give them what they want, they won't fund me. It's a very simple process, right? You're working to help them achieve their KPIs. They fund you so that you can then achieve your KPIs. It can be really helpful to go to the faculty research office or to an experienced colleague and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Here's where I'm thinking of applying. What do you think? And have that conversation, right? Because it can save you a lot of time. Next slide, please. Yeah, and Trudy's just said in the chat how that process of talking to the funding agencies works. You know, talk to them first and they will tell you how that works for any given funding agency. So how do you know that you're hitting the mark? Successful applications are fantastic. They are the gold standard. If you can find someone who's been successful, and people quite often are surprisingly generous with their past successful applications. Unsuccessful applications, they might want to resubmit. So they're probably not going to share those. And that may not be too useful for you anyway, because it didn't necessarily work, right? But successful applications can give you a bit of a template to work with, can give you a sense of how people were successful. Now, one way to do this is to go to LinkedIn, for example, and search your contacts for the name of the funding agency. Often people will list that in their LinkedIn profile, right? Or you might go to Google Scholar and construct a search that is author, a certain person who you know is pretty good at this stuff, and the name of the funding agency. And if they've mentioned it in any of their papers, it'll be in the acknowledgements, right? So you can look at where people have published to see whether they've been successful, or you can just send them an email. You can see on the funding agency's website who they've funded in the past. And you might not know someone directly, but you might know someone who works with them. And like I said, the person who's been successful has got the funding. So that application, they might be happy to share it, right? Sometimes universities keep libraries of these things, and you can ask there as well. Get feedback on your application. Tap on the expertise of your research office around, are you fitting with with what the funding agency wants. Now, the issue with this is you need to have that conversation early on, right? You need to talk to people about this fairly early, and you need to filter who you're talking to, right? So you'll get different advice from a successful colleague as you will from your research agency, research office, as you will from, your mum, right? And you need to understand who's giving you advice and what filter that advice needs to come through. But absolutely, you want to think about how to give them what they want. That's the best kind of advice I can give you in this space. They tell you, but then you need to hit the mark. And I've just got a couple of examples here from William Buckland. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here it is listed. Here are the grants they gave out for the last year. And this is in their annual report. And they've published their annual report for the last 5 years. They're just PDFs. You can download them. You can look at this page. That gives you what they've funded over the last 5 years. That's gold, right? You can then look at that. It doesn't have the names of the researchers, but something like it does have the organization. So if you know someone at the ABCN Foundation, then all of a sudden you can talk to them about, hey, could I have a look at your successful application? Next slide, please. And this is an example of where they've said, here's a project we really like. So the value of this is twofold. One, if you happen to know the people running this project, you can talk to them. But two, you can look at how they've talked about it, right? And you can frame your language in a similar way. You can, the model has been proven to be effective. Oh, I'm working with replicating something from America. This project has proved effective in America. It's that sort of trying to get in their head so that you can understand what they're doing, so that you can then give them what they want. It's as simple as that. Are there any questions on that? Because while I say it's simple, it's actually trickier than it seems. And can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So we're going to do an exercise, but questions on this or questions on what we talked about before? And is there anything in the chat? I'm sorry that it's difficult for me because I can't see the chat at the same time as I'm talking. So I have to keep swapping.
Nothing in the chat.
Yeah, no, that's okay. All right. So I'm going to call for a volunteer, and what we might do is I'll describe what we're going to do, and then we'll drop the slide, but keep it up for the moment. So what I want is someone who's willing to read out their title and their 2-line summary, right? And then have the group suggest where you might go for funding for that project. So it's a brains trust, basically. You're asking your colleagues for help. And what we're going to think about is what kinds of organizations might be interested in that project, what priorities might they have, right? How that might fit, and what other kinds of projects might they have funded, right? So that's the way people can think about who might be interested. So, Colleen, can we drop the slide, please? Can we drop the share? Oh, in fact, I can do that. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Okay, so is anyone willing to read their title and their summary? Is everyone just doing email? Am I actually talking to myself? Beatrice, you've got your hand up.
The title is Guidelines for Financial Investment Options Online. And this is the summary. We're going to create a set of rules to help young people judge the quality of information about financial investment products and a library of resources for them to learn about them. It will be the benefit is to increase the utility of the internet for young people who do not have a network of friends and family to advise them on financial investment decisions, and it overall will increase the capacity of disadvantaged young people to make the most of emerging investment options.
Okay, so throwing it open to the crowd, where do people think Beatrice might look for funding?
Maybe Telematics Trust, because they fund projects related to the use of technology to promote inclusion and social equity.
Absolutely. They have just closed for this year, which means you've got a year to plan and to think about your application for this time next year. Anyone else?
Can I come in? I don't have a specific place because I don't know so much what's available here, but what I would say it's clearly not a project. I don't think it's a project for the ARC or something very academic, but more like a foundation or maybe a government agency that would. I don't know if there's like an organization of banks or something, like financial institutions that finances this kind of schemes.
You're absolutely spot on, Jason. There's the Australian banking regulators. There's the ACCC who works in this space, and the banks themselves. So one of the things to think about in terms of where do I go for funding is who's got a problem, right? Who's got a problem with this? Now, obviously, young people have a problem with this, but also the financial institutions have a problem with this as well. They actually don't want them. And the other problem that banks have is everyone hates them, right? So they're looking for something that they can invest in that will raise their profile. And most of the banks, most famously, you'll see this with Bendigo Bank, they have a foundation that sits alongside the organisation that is willing to fund projects. And, you know, Bendigo Bank, you'll see them have a poster where they bought a bus for the local, I don't know, scout group or whatever. But absolutely, you could go there. Other suggestions?
I was just going to say that I think our faculty actually has a relationship with Bank First, because they donate, they provide funding for one of our education graduate scholarships or something. So
absolutely, looking at, when you're looking for partners, look at what partnerships the university already has, right? Because there will be someone who manages that partnership. It can be really hard to find that information, right? Because there's no kind of yellow pages for the university. But a lead like that is enough to allow you to go, oh, okay, search, Monash University for Bank First, what comes up? And it might take a bit of digging, or you might be talking to the advancement office or the student office who manage scholarships. So you can find a lot of potential leads within the organisation. What about, it sounds as though this is a problem, Beatrice, that is particularly problematic for people who are not used to how finance works in Australia. So that might be, like you said, people who don't have a network that can advise them already. So that might be, kind of orphans or wards of the state. It might be migrants, people who have recently arrived in the country. So there are other organisations that will fund. They may not be interested in funding financial literacy per se, but they absolutely will be interested in funding, helping new migrants assimilate into the country, right? And Department of Immigration, for example, not necessarily our friends a lot of the time, but might be interested in talking to you about that. Or, you might be talking to the people who have responsibility for wards of the state, right? Who might be saying, well, this is a particular issue. Now, the way to go to those organisations often is to go hand in hand with an organisation that represents your people. So you might go with a community group that represents a recent group of migrants, or you might go with an orphanage or some other organisation that takes care of young people in care, and go to the government or go to the funding agency hand in hand with that organisation. So it's not just you. That's very brief, but what I'm trying to get across is that idea of how do we think laterally. And Trudy said the Monash Research Repository can help you see who's won funding from specific people in the past, so you can get leads in that way, right? So what I'm trying to get across is think laterally around who has a problem in this space, who might also be looking to solve the problem you're trying to solve, right? If you're doing philosophy of education, that might be really tricky. Hazel said, I'm thinking of this as a teaching resource, like Money Smart, right? They look at a bunch of stuff. They produce a lot of teaching resources. So you can think about what you're trying to produce as well, and who's interested in producing that. Absolutely. We could do that. We could spend the next 2 hours just doing that for everyone. But I just wanted to do that as an example, because if you get a large enough group of people, you can do this as an exercise yourself. Right? And it works way better with alcohol, right? So getting 2 or 3 friends together and you go, this is what I'm trying to fund, and you've had a few drinks, that loosens up the cognition and allows you to come up with some crazy ideas. And crazy ideas are what you want. I keep telling people, run and Bunnings sausage sizzle, right? You need $1,000, $1,500. Well, you can pretty much guarantee you'll get that on a good day at Bunnings. And absolutely, every university is a charity. You just need to be a charity or a not-for-profit to be able to run and Bunnings sausages. No one ever listens to me, right? But that's, think like a kindergarten. Kindergartens are great at coming up with, we'll send the kids home with chocolate to sell around door to door, or we'll run a working bee or whatever. That's the kind of level you want, particularly if you're early career, particularly if you've just graduated from your PhD, because you don't need many runs on the board to make yourself stand out, right? So doing something that brings a bit of money in can really help. Okay, can we go back to the slides, please? Okay, next slide. Okay, get the team right. So no matchy-matchy. What the problem we see here is we're doing a very applied project and it's about financial inclusion. And what we've got is 3 professors from the Faculty of Education, all of whom are interested in financial inclusion. And our methodology involves a whole bunch of statistical work. Oh, none of us have done any stats, right? And the problem with having everyone be the same is you cut out a lot of possibilities of what you can do, right? You tend to just do the same methodology again. You're working with your friends again. You're all comfortable. The problem with that is it can be hard to then stretch yourself, right? So bringing people in different disciplines. So for example, that example, that is about financial literacy. It's about financial literacy, but it's also about education, right? It's about how do you get the message across? And in my opinion, every project needs an educator. I know the rest of the university may not agree with this, but I think there's absolutely scope for you in every project that's got an outreach requirement, which a lot of projects have. Having an educator in that project would strengthen them enormously because you can bring a whole bunch of expertise to how this happens, right? How people learn. You get a lot of very poor educational decisions made by physicists, for example, when they're trying to talk to people about how to learn about the galaxy. You also want to think about not just discipline, and the other thing that you might want to think about there is not just disciplinary balance, but balance across stakeholders. So I said you might want to go to a funding agency hand in hand with a community organisation that's interested in this problem, right? And that makes things more complicated, but it absolutely makes your application stronger. You need to be able to demonstrate that as a team, you are bringing together people who have the credentials to do this, the track record to do this, right? And in the notes, there's a whole bunch of stuff about how to present yourself, how to present your track record. I want to talk about that in a minute because it is crucial. And one of the things to remember is you quite often come to academia with outside experience, with outside interests, right? You can bring that expertise to bear, particularly if you're applying to someone like the William Buckland Foundation or the Telematics Trust, because they don't care, by and large, whether you have a PhD or not. What they care about is, can you make change in the space that you are applying for, right? And so you might be saying, well, I've come to education having had a whole experience in this world around this topic. And that's what's driven me. That's my passion. And they will count that as part of your track record. We often, as academics, we often leave aside the non-academic part, right? And that's true for the ARC. Absolutely, the ARC kind of says, we just want to know what you're like as an academic. But for almost every other funder, you can draw in other stuff. And you need to be able to show that you will play well together. You need to be able to show how you're going to manage this group or how this group is going to manage itself, right? Now, sometimes you go, oh, well, we've, Josephine and I have published together and Jack and I had a project together and da-da-da-da-da. And you've got evidence of that. If you don't, or even if you do, you might want to say, well, this member of the team has run several of these similar projects in the past, and they will be mentoring us in how to resolve differences, how to make sure that we stay on track. Or you might have like an advisory board that meets, twice a year of people who are stakeholders in the project but not working on the project, and who will keep you on track and will help you to, if things go wrong, will help you to get it back on track. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about how to show yourself in your best light. This is very cultural, right? And the easiest thing to talk about here is the Texans, right? Everything's bigger in Texas, right? And we have this stereotype of them blowing themselves up and saying that they are the best in the world, right? It's not necessarily true, but it's a kind of cultural thing that is more acceptable there, not as acceptable in Australia. And you want to keep it real. You want to say, this is what I know, and here's the evidence that I know that, right? You're used to putting in evidence in when you make a intellectual argument, but you can also bring evidence to bear on your track record, on your CV, right? So I am a genius, right? That is a clearly unsubstantiated statement. I am a genius. I've won the Nobel Prize twice. All of a sudden, that's a statement and evidence, right? And in fact, you can drop away the statement. You can just say, I have won the Nobel Prize twice, and let the reader decide, oh, got to be a bit of a genius to do that, right? And then they've taken that to their heart, right? So you can make these statements, and you can absolutely go through your CV and work out what are the weak statements, or you can have a friend help you do that. And then you can go, all right, what evidence can I bring to bear on that statement? And you can look, the other way you can do this is you can look at your evidence and go, oh, here's something that's really, I'm really proud of. Here's something that's really helpful. Here's something that's really useful. What does that indicate? You know, I have 30,000 followers on Twitter, right? That doesn't say much about my academic record, but it absolutely says something about being able to network on social media, right? And so it's like, what evidence do I have? How can I bring that to bear? What can I use that for? Two ways of thinking about it. Be active. It'll save you space. So, I mean, active voice in terms of how you write. It'll save you space, and it's much more engaging. And keep it flowing. Lead the reader through. This is something you want to write a story. It's absolutely a narrative, right? Yes, it's a narrative that's backed up by research, by evidence, and yes, it's a narrative that has a budget in it, which most storybooks don't have, but it's still a narrative. You're still trying to lead the reader through so that they can understand. And like we said before, for almost all the grants you do, except for the Australian Research Council, and maybe some internal grants, you want to talk to people absolutely outside your discipline, absolutely outside of academia. So just keep it simple. Next slide. Okay, so little exercise, and then we're going to take another break. Think about the project that you described, right? And take 5 minutes to just say, all right, who would be best for this project? And you can think about it in two ways. One is, who are the people who are going to run the project, right? And what skills do they have? What skills do I need? And so they're names, right? They're people that you are willing to sit down and have a coffee with and say, I've got this project. Do you want to come on board? So they're people you know. You've got to be able to name them, right? And then there are the people you're going to hire. So these don't have names, but they have skills, right? Oh, we're going to do a qualitative methodology. There's an enormous amount of stats that needs to be crunched. We're going to need to manage all that data. So we need a research assistant who has skills and experience in dealing with big data sets, right? And that's your person, if you like, right? So it's a kind of little job description. And just take 5 minutes to think about who that might be for the project that you have described. So the project that you wrote your title and your summary about, right? So 5 minutes on the clock. We will come back in 5 minutes. Okay. Who found it difficult to think about who they might have on their team or what skills they might need.
I thought it was kind of easy to identify like people that I would need. I just don't necessarily know them.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about a couple of ways to do that. Sometimes you can hire them in, right? So you don't need to know them because you're hiring that expertise. Sometimes you're leaning on kind of friends of friends for introductions. It's kind of like old school dating, where you don't meet people on your phone, you meet people like through your friends or your colleagues. That can be tricky because all of these relationships are trust relationships. So you absolutely want to have some cups of coffee with those people, because if you like walk away thinking, I never want to have coffee with that person again, the last thing, it doesn't matter how qualified they are, the last thing you want to do is get into a 3-year contract with them to produce some research, right? The other way that's much harder, I think, is there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that talks about, if you're going to a conference, read up on who's giving talks and make sure you shake their hand and have your 2-minute tip, your elevator pitch ready to go. I don't actually think the world works that way. But you can do that for organizations where it's hard to do that for individuals. You can do that for organizations. So I'm not talking about universities, but I'm talking about, that you want to partner with a particular organization, or that it would be, it might be ideal for that organization. They might be interested. You can absolutely try and work out in the organization who's the right person to talk to, and then have a conversation with that person where you're saying, look, here's how this might be useful to you. Is there anyone in this organization that we would be, really interested in this? Does this fit what your organization is trying to do? And it's for some organizations, it'll come down to, yes, that sits under Harriet. Harriet takes care of that area. Have a conversation with Harriet, right? And Harriet goes, yes, that ticks off 2 of my KPIs. I'm kind of interested. A lot of the time, it's like, no, actually, we're not really interested in that. The timeline's too long, or it doesn't suit us at this time, that kind of thing. Yeah, you need to, you end up infinite numbers of coffees before you find that. Were there other things that people found difficult about that, or difficult about kind of the earlier exercises where they would think about where they go for money or anything like that? Okay, we have 2 rules to go. The nice thing about coming to something where they say there's 5 rules is you can tick them off as you go. We're on the downward hill. Can we share the slides, please? Okay, next one. Thank you. All right, so this is a very simple kind of concept, but it's hard to get right. Getting your project right, there's a whole bunch of complexity. We've talked about getting the team right. We've talked about, finding who might be interested in funding it. We've talked about, how the application process works. The core of it is your idea and how you express your idea. And the core of that is this one question: what's new, right? So a lot funding agencies will use different terms to describe this, but I like the words significance and innovation, which are words that the ARC used to use, right, and still do to a certain extent. Significance is, why does this matter? Why is this important, right? What is the significance of my project? Now, it might be a really practical project that's trying to solve a problem. It might be a more theoretical project that's trying to extend what we know. Sometimes it's a mix of both. You've got a practical aspect, but you've got, theory building as well. Ideally, that's true. And the significance can change depending on who you're talking to. Your community partner, you might be describing it in a particular way or using a particular language and emphasizing the problem that they see. The funding agency, you might be talking about it, if it's a philanthropic, for example, you might be talking about it more as the civic aspect of that problem and how this will build society or how this will raise people out of disadvantage or whatever their priority is. But you need to understand what is new, what is significant in what you're doing. Now, there's a couple of traps here. It is not sufficient to just be something new, doing something new, or to have identified a gap, right, in the literature, right? And the reason for that is sometimes the reason no one's done it, the reason there's a gap is because no one cares. It's just not important enough to worry about, right? So that can be a problem. The other problem we see in this space is what we term bad literature reviews. So this is where you think it's new or you think it's significant, but someone else has done this already. And this can be particularly a problem where someone else has done this already, just not in your discipline, right? And you can't cover all the disciplines, right? And so you need to be able to say that this is new, that this is a significant problem, and we can solve it, right? Or quite often you're not saying we can solve it. Quite often you're saying, and we can contribute to the solution in this way, right? And that works whether you are unpacking a knotty theoretical problem or whether it's a practical problem, right? For almost every problem out there, someone's already tried to do something about it. What you're saying is we have this new data, this new technique. We are working with these partners that will allow us to make steps where other people have not been able to progress in the past, right? And the normal convention is to not diss the people that came before you. So you're not saying everything they did was rubbish. I have the answer. You're saying building on what they have done before, we can now progress in this way. And that's mostly because one of the people might be reading your application. Is really what that's about. Academia can be a very small space. And sometimes the problem itself can be new, right? And that can be, we saw this a lot around the growth of the internet, and now we're seeing it around kind of algorithmic knowledge, where we haven't had to deal with the problem of, people scooping like 100 million people's information and running it through an algorithm before. That's a new problem for society to face. So sometimes it's the problem that is new, but most often it is your approach to a problem that is new, and that's your innovation. That's where you're bringing something that will really help. And if you don't have one of those, then you've got a real problem. If you don't know, or if you can't express why this matters to the funder, and if you can't then tell them what's clever that you're going to do that will allow you to make progress, then you're missing a big component of what you need, right? And mostly it's you do know that. It's just around getting your story straight, making it very clear, smoothing it out so that people understand it. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other part of getting your project right, that's a very theoretical, that's a very kind of intellectual exercise, is thinking about what's new, thinking about how you're going to describe it, thinking about how you're going to solve it in a way that people will understand. This is much more practical, right? This is who's going to do it, how long is it going to take, what steps do we need to do, what is our plan, right? And the main issue I run across here with researchers is they say, oh, well, you know, it's all going to change, right? No one could have predicted in March 2020 that the world was going to go into lockdown, and that threw everything up in the air. Yes, that is true. Your project will change. Research, by its very nature, involves risk. Risk involves uncertainty. What you're showing here is that you have a concrete plan for what to do. The funder understands that things will change. You understand that things will change. You might need to explain to your external partners that things will change, particularly like they don't understand going through the ethics committee, right? For example, right? Oh, we got knocked back. That's going to add another month to the timeline, whatever. But no one will fund you if you can't show a reasonable plan of progress. Because then you're just saying, oh, look, give me the money and trust me. All right, something good will happen. No one's going to fund that, right? And so what you're doing here is you're stepping out what you're going to do, what the major steps are that you're going to take for your project, and what you're going to do. It sounds easy, but it's really actually hard. This example is a very simple 12-month project. You know, first month we're going to present to the partners, right? We've got to get them on board, make sure everyone's in the same page. Next 4 months, we're going to review what's happened before. Next 3 months, we're going to develop drafts for 3 things. And then there's a bit of overlap because in terms of developing the first one, we can then start on testing it before we finish, you know, kind of draft of the third one. And there's a whole bunch of time at the bottom to report to partners and write up. It's a really simple little project, right? What often happens is people know what they're going to do in the first couple of months, right? If you're interviewing people, for example, first step, ethics approval. As you go forward, it gets much vaguer. It's much harder to think about what you're going to do in the last 6 months of a 3-year project than what you're going to do in the first 6 months of a 3-year project. But you need to get to the same level of detail across the board, and it's not an easy thing to do. In the notes I have a link out to, if you've never done a Gantt chart before, how to make a simple Gantt chart, which is essentially how to think through all the steps, right? These are, yeah, these little diagrams, they are a learned skill, but they're really handy once you know how to make them. They're not as hard as they look. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and in, excuse me, in getting the project right, you need to bring your partners on board. Now, some projects, you don't have any partners, particularly if you're, excuse me, applying for internal funding, there may be no external partners. But often you do want to do something with an external partner because they can make change in the issue you're trying to address, right? Whatever that might be, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's some problem that the project in the UK is investigating. Absolutely, I work with people who do nothing but theoretical maths, for example, or theoretical physics, where there are no external partners. But most of the time there are, and it's really useful to have them on board, right? You can have them on board in different ways. You can have them on board as part of an advisory committee that just is going to meet once or twice a year, keep you on track. Yeah, you know, you might do that over dinner or you might do it over Zoom or whatever, but it's a formal process where you present to them and they say, oh, here's what's happened in our sector since we last spoke. So two-way dialogue. Or you might bring them on board as partners in the project, particularly to give you their expertise, sometimes their data, and then pick up the project at the end and run with it. Now, particularly government, if you're trying to influence policy, for example, right? The last thing you want to do is go to a government, like a ministerial advisor, and say, hey, that problem you've got, we've got a solution, right? And we've got it all worked out and documented. And the problem with that is they're going to go, I've never heard of you, and I don't know who you are or what you're doing, so I'm not going to listen. Whereas if you bring them on board at the start and get them involved, by the time you get to the end, if it all goes well, they're saying, can you please get this finished so that we can implement, right? It's the difference between those two things. Would you suggest that for big projects, a project advisory group is a good idea? Yeah, there's a level under which a project advisory group, you know, if you've just got like $2,500 and you're going to spend it over the next 9 months, then you don't need a project advisory group. If you've got, you know, a 3-year project, absolutely. I think having someone that you want to report to, not that you have to report to, but that you actively want to report to, can really help you stay on track and can bring you back when and can help just with drift, you know, where you've kind of lost your way a bit, you're in the research mess, it's all a bit muddled, and you're like, let's go talk to, and it may, you know, you may not have another advisory committee coming up for 3 months, but you're like, let's just go to this person on the advisory panel, have a phone call with them, talk through this problem. You know, I had this a couple of years ago where I sit on the board of a not-for-profit. It's tiny, and the person rang me and said, I've got this real problem with the funding agency. And in the end, the decision was walk away. You know, there was no way to solve that problem that wasn't going to cause an enormous amount of pain and work. But having someone outside of her own head and outside of her team to talk to was really helpful. So yes, I absolutely think you can think about it that way. When you're working with partners, absolutely you need to understand their timelines and they need to understand your timelines. This is the hardest thing to bring into a project. Partners outside of academia don't understand how long it takes to get stuff done. They're often used to putting a solution in place without necessarily understanding the underlying problem. So for them, it's really quick to put a solution in place. For you, actually, it's understanding the underlying problem that's the important bit. So they need to be comfortable with how long it's going to take, and they need to understand that. And particularly, like I had 2 researchers who came to me and said, oh, look, it's just been announced that we've been successful with this funding, but we can't get in touch with our partners. They're not responding at all. And when we unpacked it, they had applied for this funding 7 months earlier, and they had not spoken to those partners in the intervening 7 months. In the meantime, one of them had got promoted to a different country, and the other one had left the industry. And so they had no one to talk to, which meant, you know, they had to go back and rebuild that relationship all over again. So there needs to be an understanding of the timeline and how you're going to manage that timeline, right? Because it can be hard and it can be a long-term relationship. And outcomes. Think about what the outcomes are. Outcomes for partners from projects, like for academics, by and large, refereed journal article, conference paper, tick, tick, done. For partners, there's a huge amount of variety of what they will find useful. It might be a forum that discusses potential, you know, approaches to this problem and brings people together. The nice thing about universities is we offer neutral space where people who normally would be like not collaborators or even competitors, can come together and talk about big ideas. It might be a website. It might be a simple guide to whatever the problem is, whatever the solution is, something that their stakeholders can understand. It might be a training program that they then run, right? Where you've developed the kind of materials and they run it because they've got the outreach to the community and you don't. So there's a whole bunch of different things. All of them will not be a referee journal article or a conference paper, right? Because you're going to have to take your findings and step it into language they can use. And if you don't account for that in your timeline, you'll run into trouble as well. So everyone needs to understand where the project's going. Everyone needs to understand how long it's going to take. And everyone needs to understand what's going to come out at the other end and be happy with that. And it turns out that's not as hard as you think. It just needs a really honest conversation and a bit of thinking about, a bit of listening to what they're saying and coming back to them and saying, you know, oh, you said blah. Does that mean that that this needs to go to your international board for approval? Oh, yes, it does. That takes at least 2 months. Okay, glad I asked that question before we set up the timeline, you know, that kind of stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've got an exercise, but before that, can we just talk about how people have difficulty conceptualizing their project or conceptualizing their relationship with their partners? And maybe let's drop the slides for a minute. Thanks, Colleen.
I've got an example. Oh,
go ahead. All right, I'll just go quickly. The last time, well, it was a really good project, but what we struggled with, because it was a partnership with industry, and it was really hard to get consensus on the sort of outputs and like the end goal. Like it felt like we were working kind of a moving target, and that made it challenging for us as the researchers to feel like we knew what they wanted and what we were giving them. And so getting clarity at the beginning on the outcome or the end result, I found that challenging.
Yeah, it takes a long time, right? What did you do in the end?
It was a very iterative project, and we just kept working collaboratively every step of the way and being really open to feedback from each other. And we got there in the end, but it just felt like we were always a little bit unsure of if what we were doing was what they wanted.
Yeah. And that iterativeness works really well. Like it's a really good way to solve that problem, as long as you're able to say, I'm sorry, there's not enough money in the budget anymore to, you know, build Luna Park, right? You got to be able to put limits around it and have that conversation that's like, well, we don't really need Luna Park. We just need a balloon on a stick. Oh, okay, we can afford a balloon on a stick, right? You know, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I understand. And the other way is to more formally try and work it out ahead of time and write it down in a contract, right? The problem with that is the person who's your contact at the organization leaves and a new person comes in and they look at the contract and go, well, I'm not really interested in that. And all of a sudden you're back into that unknown space again. Other people.
I'm not sure if what I was going to say relates to what we were talking about at the moment. I was just going to say, in relation to what you were saying about, you know, the terminology and kind of how you shape your description of the project. The idea I'm sort of working with at the moment, or, you know, imagining I'm going to work on for the next little while, it has been kind of in the making for a long time. And the way that I sort of talking about and thinking about some of the central ideas continues to be a much longer work in progress than I'd sort of thought. So some of your feedback about, I guess, not putting in a submission when it's a sort of half-baked idea, but, you know, that just kind of really looking at what to you is like an obvious unexplored topic in other disciplines might be looked at, you know, if it's maybe a word that is used in different ways in different fields, you know. So I've had to kind of really continue to kind of keep thinking through how to talk about a particular problem in a way that to then, you know, a group reviewing it who aren't necessarily from your discipline would see what you're getting at and not think, oh, you're claiming to do something that in their field it means something quite different.
Yep. And particularly, you know, language encodes both culture, but also concepts, and concepts are very different in very different fields, right? And so if your project is about concepts, that can be really tricky. Two things on that. One is, if you're writing the idea and just trying to refine it, you're writing for yourself. You may find that when you write for a grant application, there's a very fixed audience that you kind of can imagine. And all of a sudden the writing will become clearer because it's like, okay, I know who I'm writing for now. That can help. And just going back to Aaron's point about connecting with the industry partner and just that iterative process. One thing that I really like is the idea of one up, one down, and one either side. So this is, you are connected with someone in an organization and you just ask them, could you please introduce me to one up, your boss, one down, someone underneath you, possibly someone who might take over if you win Touch Lotto and go and drink Mai Tais in Fiji, and one either side. A couple of people in different parts of the organization who are at the same level who would just be useful to know. And if you explain to them that it's to protect the project, they will understand that, right? You know, if you explain to them, if you leave, the project is sunk, please introduce me to your boss, please introduce me to someone underneath you, please introduce me to a few other people in the organization, people will generally understand that. Okay, one more exercise, and this is the last one we have to do today. So can we have the slides back, please, Carleen? Okay, so you've thought about what your title and what your summary is. You've thought about who your team might be. Now, give yourself a set amount of time that you're going to do the project for. And I would suggest either 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, right? Because they're fairly standard times for projects. And you're saying to yourself, in this 10 minutes, you're saying, what are we going to do in that time? What is the team going to do? So list your activities, and you can chunk it down. It might be, you know, if it's just a short 1 year project, then you might be going, okay, in 3 month steps, what am I going to do? Or in 6 month steps, if it's a longer project. And for bonus points, if you want to level up, how much will each step cost? You probably won't know that, but how would I find that out? So if, for example, one of your steps is, we need to analyze this data and we're going to need an RA for that, and it's going to be, you know, probably someone with a PhD, and I reckon they're probably going to need 1 day a week for 6 months to do that work, right? That's costing, right? You've costed that because you can then, someone can then go out, you or someone else can then go out and put a fixed cost on that, right? You don't need to work out how much it costs to fly to Vanuatu to do field work in Vanuatu. You just need to say 2 return tickets to Vanuatu for myself and the research assistant, right? And we're going to be staying there for 3 weeks. So that's what I mean by costing each step, you know, describe it in a way that can be costed. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to just, in fact, I'm not going to, looking at the time, I'm going to say, let's spend 5 minutes on this. So I'm cutting you in half. So I'll call you back in 5 minutes time. Just see what you can get done. I'll come back for questions right at the end. So if you had troubles with that one, just let me know at the end. But let's go to our last rule, which is about time. Can we have the slides, please, Colin? Yep, that's the one. Beautiful. Okay. So rule 5, have time on your side. Basically, be nice to your future self is what this rule is all about. So the nice thing about grants is that you know often 12 months ahead of time when they're going to come up. So you can absolutely plan backwards. You can because they often run on a 12-month cycle. Sometimes they run on a 6-month cycle. Occasionally they run on a 3-month cycle. Sometimes you get funding bodies that say, we'll accept an application at any time, which is a disaster because then academics can never actually do that because we all need timelines. We all need deadlines to get anything done. But you can work backwards. So if you know, for example, that you want to apply to William Buckland next year or to Telematics Trust next year, you've got 12 months. So how long is the university going to need to check it and sign off on it? How long is it going to take you to write it? And you can work that out by talking to someone who's written one before or written a similar sort of grant before, right? How long did they take? Who are you going to get to check it? And how long are they going to need? When are you going to give it to them? Being able to tell them, in 2 months, I will give you this thing and I'd like your feedback within 5 days. If they say, that's great, but I'm going to be in Paris with my family, so that's not going to work for me. You can plot all that out now. Basically, you can build yourself a calendar for the grants you're going to apply for. You can also think about it in this way. If it's your job to apply, and I think I said this earlier, how much time do you have to spend on this, right? How much time can you carve out? And it might be, there's some people write a little bit every day. Some people write, over summer and they write one big thing. Some people have every Friday where they do stuff. So you can think about it that way. What's your pattern for grant applications? How are you going to work on them? And the writing is going to be the smallest bit because there's going to be reading and grant application, grant guidelines. There's going to be reading successful past applications. There's going to be talking to partners if you need partners. There's going to be getting feedback from people. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into your timeline, but you need to think about that and go, well, because once you work that out, you may find that you can only apply for one or maybe one big and one small grant in a year, right? And your ideas of, I'm going to write, 5 grants next year. Actually, that's one every 2 months almost. That's probably not going to happen, right? You can be a part of a team where you're contributing a small amount to a grant application that someone else is doing most of the work on. And so you can end up on more grant applications that way. It's a team sport. You don't have to be doing it all yourself. Right? You don't always have to lead, is what I'm saying. Know the processes, and that's not just, that's the processes within the university. Who needs to approve? Your head of school or head of department needs to approve because it's about your time. Maybe someone in the faculty needs to check the budget. All sorts of things like that. There's all sorts of approval processes that might need to happen. But in particular, if you're working with other partners, and they are putting in their time or they are putting in their money or they're providing you with data or they're providing you with access to their clients, they're going to have a timeline that they need to stick to. And you need to understand how that works, how other people's money, because time is money for them, what's the approval process for them. And then just very briefly, all writing is rewriting. All grant applications are resubmissions. Cultivate patience and resilience. This is about understanding how much it hurts to be unsuccessful and how much of that hurt you can bear, and having a long-term plan. So if you've got a project that's like, if this doesn't get funded this year, I'm not interested in doing it anymore, that's a very high-risk strategy because often, it's the funding comes through on the second or the third attempt, and that might take 2 or 3 years to get right. So you really need to cultivate that patient, that strength through patience, and just understanding. We talk about, you know, you write your heart, you write your passion onto the grant application page, and then someone at the funding agency just stamps all over it and gives it back to you and says, no, we're not interested in that, right? And that hurts, right? And you know, toughen up, princess, is not the answer to that. So you've got to understand how much of that you can cope with, because it can be a real problem sometimes. And that's okay. I've got a couple more things that I want to say. Can we just move to the next slide? And then I want to just open up the discussion. Okay, so here's the takeaways. Don't be reactive, right? Don't be going, oh, there's this thing that's closing next week. All right, I'll go for that, right? Plan ahead, do your research. Always give yourself the time that you need, and in fact, more time, because it always takes more time. But do apply, right? People talk about success rates. If you don't apply, you have no chance of being funded. If you do apply, you have some chance of being funded. And an unsuccessful application is not a failure. It's not a failure on your part. And quite often it's not a failure at all, because you resubmit it and it does get funded eventually. So there's one more thing that I want to, and there's two more things that I want to talk about. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, where do you go for help? You go to edu-research@monash.edu. So that will go to the Education Faculty Research Office, and they have a team there who's happy to help you. They're not just happy to help you, they are paid to help you. And so you want to use that resource to get advice. And, you know, finding source of fundings, preparing your application, submission requirements, and what happens after. Trudy, do you want to say a few words there?
Sure. After they win, you mean?
No. Yeah, and also not just beforehand, but also, you know, if you need to do a variation later on or something like that.
So most post-award matters are managed by the Central Monash Research Office post-awards team, but we can step you through that. So if you win a grant, our office hooks you up with the relevant Monash Research Office, and we work together to make sure that the project's set up, the fund's set up, the invoicing schedule's all in the pure system, and that all takes place as it's meant to happen. If you need to make variations, you know, for example, for ARCs, which is quite common, if the project's delayed for whatever reason, then we can manage that variation process again, working with the Monash Research Office post-awards team.
Great. And I don't know about you, Trudy, but I think of faculty research officers as being like a concierge service.
Yep.
Where if you have a question and you're in the foreign city, which is Monash, because you can't work out where you got to go, ask Trudy's team, right? Ask edu-research@monash.edu.
Definitely. And as part of these great resources that Jonathan's provided, we'll also give you a link to a new intranet page that we've created that addresses all the things you should think about when you're considering applying for external funding, which pretty much covers off on everything Jonathan said, but it's a one-pager that we'll also circulate with his notes.
And one more slide, because this is the homework. Okay, so here's your checklist to do after this time. Do you know which sectors would be interested in my research? If not, how do I work that out? Do you know who my research team will be, and whether that's the names of the people or the sorts of skills that you will need if you're hiring in, right? And if not, how am I going to work that out? How am I going to find those people? Do you know the types of funding bodies that would be interested in research, in funding this? Okay, and if not, how can I work that out? Do I know who to contact in the faculty research office? And yes, you do, because we've just put it on the previous slide.
Jonathan, can I ask Kate and Carleen just to switch their cameras on so everyone can see what they look like? Because it's been a while since we've all been in the building. So you've got myself, Kate and Carleen, who all have some involvement with external grants. Carleen's your main person, and Kate and I help her out in peak times.
So Carleen, do you want to drop the slides? Stop the share.
Sorry, Carleen,
Okay.
put you on the spot.
There we go. Do you just want to say hello, Kate and Carleen?
Hey
Hello.
everyone, so I'm your main contact person if you need help. Use the Edu Research role account. Someone in the team will definitely pick it up and get in touch with you.
Okay. And I've kept this one short in part because like I haven't spent as much time on Rule 5 as all the others, in part because we're at the end of a long period and everyone's tired. You've got two choices. We were due to finish in 12 minutes. So I can give you 12 minutes of your life back, or if you, and so you're welcome to leave now, or if you've got questions or you want to ask me anything, or you want to talk to Kate or Carleen or Trudy about anything, then you've got 12 minutes to get your question, answered.
And while we're sort of closing down, can I also just throw a link to a Google form? Would really love your feedback on your experience of today's workshop. I'll just drop that in now. Very quickly.
And Carleen told me about that at the start, and I absolutely knew that I was going to forget to mention that. So thank you.
All good. There you go. Just so everyone knows, to recap, you can expect an email from us sometime this week, and that email will give you a link to the recording of the session, fingers crossed if it worked, the slides, as well as the notes that Jonathan was referring to today.
So who's got a project they want funded? And in terms of filling out that little Google form, you are educators. I am not. So I'm more than happy to take feedback. I feel that this is way too didactic. There's way too much chalk and talk in this workshop, and I'm trying to rework it to make it work better. But there's a lot of material as well. So you've probably are trained to know how to deal with that. So if you want to give feedback on how to improve the workshop, more than happy to receive that. What's your coaching fever work got us one-on-one? I have a 4-day-a-week job and a PhD that I'm trying to submit before the middle of next year, and a blog that is way too under-resourced at the moment. I can suggest people, but I think actually you're probably better to go to Trudy and Kate and Carleen if you want to hire external people. They probably also can suggest people. You want to, it's a fraught world. You absolutely, if someone says, I can promise you that you will win this grant, walk away, right? That is not what you are seeking. If someone says, I can help you to clarify your ideas, I can help you to understand who your audience is, I can help you to lift some of the work off you by preparing the budget, by straightening out, your CV, that sort of thing, by getting it all in order, then maybe that's okay. But you're going to have to pay for that yourself. So you're going to need something in your earnings fund to do that. Lisa.
I guess it might be from your broad experience, but also the people in the research office. Do we have any mechanisms where when internal grants aren't successful, we have a way of sifting through where a specific grant, let's say I put in a grant, it wasn't successful, or it wasn't funded, I should say. And there can be some specific feedback, because often the feedback isn't that helpful. And I have worked in an institution where we were allocated as a research committee to go and talk to that person to try and get them to the next stage and enhance it for that particular funding. Is there any discussion at this point that's been talking about that?
I'm sorry if that's your experience, Lisa Hunter. And Kate might be able to talk a bit more about internal grants, but we've been we've done various things over the years. We have done that. So we've allocated a person from the committee to go and give extra feedback where we think it's necessary. We've tried, you know, I know under previous ADRs, Mandy, for example, we tried to give as detailed feedback as possible. So everyone in the panel gave some feedback. We consolidated that into a letter. I'm not really involved in internal grants these days, but Kate, who's just back today. So if I don't know if you've got anything else to say, Kate, on what happens or what has happened with internal grants recently.
Yeah, so there's not too much more that I can add. I know that with Mandy, and I have been on leave for quite a while, so I haven't gone through it with Neil yet. But like you said, Trudy, with Mandy, there was a lot of discussion in the meetings, and then we go through all of the points and consolidate them into a letter. And that letter obviously goes back to the ADR and is all checked and everything like that. But it's definitely something that I can chat with Neil about as well moving forward. Yeah, because we obviously want to give a feedback that's helpful for you to then go ahead and apply again and use, you know, to move into external grant applications. So yeah, definitely something I'll bring up with Neil for you.
Good on you. Thank you.
Lisa Hunter, the other thing, I'm not going to touch internal grants. That's Monash Uni space. I don't know that space. But when you can sometimes go back to external agencies and ask for feedback. And the one thing that you want to know, or the two things you want to know, one is, why did my grant fail? Why did my application fail? And how do I get funded? And they're the two things that they find it most difficult to tell you, right? Because often it's, well, it was good application, but it just didn't get ranked highly enough. It was beaten out by the competition, which is not useful to you. Yeah. What they are much more able to talk about is if you ask them, why did the ones that won win? They find it much easier to go, well, because it's public knowledge most of the time, right? And so they can't talk about the specifics of a grant application, but they can talk about, well, we really like this project because, and then it's you reflecting on what you did. And sometimes you go, well, I did all that, you know, I didn't do anything wrong. I just didn't make it all the way up to the top of the ladder. But sometimes you're like, oh, okay, that's really helpful. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and some of that clarification comes through dialogue, I know, because it's in terms of making meaning, but to use it as a development process, like you say, having other people's eyes is useful, but the granting authority or the people making the judgment, you know, that's where it comes to the crunch. So getting into their heads sometimes is really valuable. Yeah, and you're right, a dialogue really can really help. Often, like Beeson Foundation, you know, it's a great philanthropic trust, but it's a family and they hire someone part-time. So they just don't have the resources to talk to the applicants, right? Yeah. I totally understand that, but it's how do we facilitate people, even for ourselves within our own system? Yeah. And look, the other thing to keep in mind is some internal grants are run by the faculty, some are run by the university. Yeah. So, you know, Kate and Carleen and Trudy may have no capacity in, you know, no agency in whether you get feedback or not on university internal grants. Yeah. Thank you. That's right. Are we good? All right. Let's say thank you very much. And see you soon. I don't know. Talk soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carleen.
Thanks.
Sue may have walked away. You there, Sue? Can we? There we go. No. Oh, hello. Did you want to just say? Did you have a question or something?
No, I was just trying to catch someone else.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all good. No, it's okay. I'll get her via email or something. Thank you.
Okay.
That was really useful.
Thanks
No
so
problem.
much, Sue.
Apologize. It was I was the one that had to go out and then come back after an hour. So I sort
That's
of
fine.
yeah.
All good. All good.
Excellent.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Sue. See ya.
Bye.
See you later.
Okay, let's stop recording.